National Electrical Code Section 110.26a dictates the depth of working space in front of electrical equipment. This depth is measured from the exposed live parts or from the enclosure or opening if the live parts are enclosed. The depth requirements vary based on the voltage to ground and the conditions present. Specifically, 110.26a stipulates that working space is not required in the back or sides of assemblies like dead front switchboards. Now, turning to the width of the working space. 110.26a mandates that the width of the working space in front of the electrical equipment must be at least 30 inches. This width requirement ensures sufficient space for personnel to safely operate and maintain the equipment. However, the question at hand pertains to whether there's a corresponding code requirement specifying a minimum depth within this 30-inch width. The answer to the specific question is no. The code focuses on the overall working space depth as determined by voltage and condition, not on imposing an additional depth restriction within the 30-inch width. To elaborate on the depth requirements as specified in 110.26a, let's consider the three conditions outlined in 110.26a. A. 110.26a. B. And 110.26a. T. Condition 1, as defined in 110.26a, involves exposed live parts on one side and grounded parts on the other side, or exposed live parts on one side and insulated parts on the other side. For systems operating at 0 to 150 volts to ground, the minimum clear working distance is 3 feet. For systems operating at 151 to 600 volts to ground, the minimum clear working distance increases to 3 feet. For systems operating at 601 to 2500 volts to ground, the minimum clear working distance becomes 4 feet. For systems operating at 2501 to 9000 volts to ground, the minimum clear working distance increases to 5 feet. For systems operating at 9001 to 25,000 volts to ground, the minimum clear working distance is 6 feet. And finally, for systems operating at 25,001 to 75,000 volts to ground, the minimum clear working distance reaches 8 feet. Condition 2, as defined in 110.26a, addresses the situation where there are exposed live parts on both sides of the working space, but these parts are guarded or insulated. For systems operating at 0 to 150 volts to ground, the minimum clear working distance is 3 feet. For systems operating at 151 to 600 volts to ground, the minimum clear working distance is 3 feet 6 inches. For systems operating at 601 to 2500 volts to ground, the minimum clear working distance becomes 4 feet 6 inches. For systems operating at 2501 to 9000 volts to ground, the minimum clear working distance increases to 6 feet. For systems operating at 9001 to 25,000 volts to ground, the minimum clear working distance is 8 feet. And finally, for systems operating at 25,001 to 75,000 volts to ground, the minimum clear working distance reaches 10 feet. Condition 3, as defined in 110.26a, involves exposed live parts on both sides of the working space where one side is grounded. For systems operating at 0 to 150 volts to ground, the minimum clear working distance is 3 feet. For systems operating at 151 to 600 volts to ground, the minimum clear working distance is 4 feet. For systems operating at 601 to 2500 volts to ground, the minimum clear working distance becomes 5 feet. For systems operating at 2501 to 9000 volts to ground, the minimum clear working distance increases to 6 feet. For systems operating at 9001 to 25,000 volts to ground, the minimum clear working distance is 9 feet. And finally, for systems operating at 25,001 to 75,000 volts to ground, the minimum clear working distance reaches 10 feet. It is important to note that these distances are minimums, and in many practical applications, a larger working space may be necessary to ensure safe and effective operation. Now, let's shift our focus to the width requirement of 30 inches as stipulated in 110.26a. This 30-inch width is intended to provide sufficient lateral space for workers to move and maneuver while working on or near electrical equipment. It's essential that this width is maintained clear of obstructions to ensure unimpeded access. The code does not specify where this width should be in relation to the equipment, and it is up to the installer to make sure it is in front of the equipment. While the code mandates a minimum width of 30 inches, it's important to recognize that a larger width may be necessary in certain situations. For instance, if the equipment is particularly wide or complex, a wider working space may be needed to facilitate safe and efficient work practices. Similarly, if multiple workers are likely to be working in the area simultaneously, a larger width may be necessary to accommodate their movements. In addition to the depth and width requirements, 110.26A3 also addresses the height of the working space. This section mandates that the working space must be clear and extend from the grade, floor, or platform to a height of at least 6 feet 6 inches with the height of the equipment, whichever is greater. This height requirement ensures that workers have sufficient headroom to perform their task safely and comfortably. Obstructions are not allowed within this working space. It is important to remember that the working space requirements outlined in 110.26 are not merely suggestions, they are mandatory requirements that must be strictly adhered to. Failure to comply with these requirements can result in serious safety hazards, including electric shock, arc flash, and other electrical injuries. Furthermore, non-compliance can also lead to code violations and potential legal liabilities. To ensure compliance with 110.26, it is essential to carefully review the specific requirements applicable to the installation in question. This includes considering the voltage to ground, the conditions present, and the physical dimensions of the equipment and the surrounding space. It's also advisable to consult with a qualified electrical inspector or engineer to ensure that the installation meets all applicable code requirements. In addition to the specific requirements outlined in 110.26, it's important to consider other relevant safety standards and best practices. This includes wearing appropriate personal protective equipment, such as insulated gloves and eye protection, and following lockout/tagout procedures when working on or near energized equipment. It's also crucial to maintain a clean and organized working environment to minimize the risk of accidents and injuries. In summary, while the National Electrical Code mandates a minimum width of 30 inches for the working space in front of electrical equipment, it does not impose a separate depth requirement within that 30-inch width. The overall depth of the working space is determined by the voltage to ground and the conditions present, as outlined in 110.26 on. It is crucial to adhere to all applicable working space requirements to ensure the safety of personnel and prevent electrical hazards. By understanding and complying with these requirements, you can help create a safer working environment and minimize the risk of electrical accidents. Remember, safety should always be the top priority when working with electricity.